Imagine you're walking down a road made of nothing but dust and regret. The sun is a hot coin on the back of your neck, and over your shoulder, you're carrying the only person you have left in this world. That was Clarabelle's life. 16 years old, with boots too big for her feet and a soul worn thinner than a beggar's blanket. The little boy on her back, her brother Eli, hadn't said a word in a week. Not since the fire. The fire had eaten everything. Their home, their parents, their future. It came in the night, a hungry orange beast that swallowed their lives and spit out ash. Now all they had was the road, and ahead, shimmering like a mirage, was a town with a name that sounded like a bad omen, Cinderfield. It was a crooked, mean-looking place, a church with no bell, a saloon with no laughter. The whole town seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the next bad thing to happen. As Clara walked down the main street, she could feel eyes on her. Windows were slits. Doors were closed mouths. A girl caked in dirt, carrying a boy in a flour sack, wasn't a traveler. She was a problem. The sheriff sat on a porch, unwhittling a piece of wood. He didn't get up. He just watched her pass with eyes as cold and empty as a snake's belly. "Keep moving, girl," he grunted. "Nothing for you here." Clara didn't look at him. She just kept walking. Her legs were screaming. Her heart was a cold stone in her chest. But she had a plan. A desperate, crazy plan. Just past the town, tucked behind a stand of skeletal oak trees, was a ranch. The McCrae Ranch. It was a dark, hulking place, leaning to one side like an old man with a broken back. Smoke curled from its chimney, a thin gray finger pointing at the sky. This was it, the end of the line. She stood at the gate for a long time, the wood rough against her bleeding hands. Eli stirred on her shoulder, a tiny whimper escaping his lips. "Just a little more," she whispered, her own voice a stranger to her ears. She walked up the gravel path. Each crunch of the stones under her feet sounded like a gunshot in the silence. She knocked on the heavy wooden door. The sound was so small she thought the wind might have carried it away. She waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. The door creaked open. A man stood there, framed in the yellow lamplight. He was tall, built like an old tree, with a beard that looked like it held 100 secrets. His eyes had seen too much. They didn't even seem to blink. It was Will McCrae, the man the whole town was afraid of. Clara swallowed the lump of fear in her throat. Her lips trembled, but her voice, when it came, was steady, frighteningly steady. "I'll work for you," she said, the words tasting like rust in her mouth. "I'll clean your house. I'll milk your cows." She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the last part. "And I'll warm your bed." She stared right into his dead eyes. "Just spare my brother." The silence that followed was so thick you could have choked on it. McCrae's eyes flickered from her face to the bundle on her back, then back again. His expression didn't change. It was like looking at a granite cliff. "I don't run an orphanage," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm not asking for charity," Clara shot back, her voice sharper now. "I'm asking for a trade. You need help. I need a roof. We're square." McCrae looked past her, out at the dying sun. He looked tired. Not just tired from a long day, but tired deep down in his bones, a weariness that had been settling in for years. Then he did something she didn't expect. He stepped back from the door. "Inside," he said, his voice flat, "before the coyotes get any ideas." Clara didn't hesitate. She stepped over the threshold into the house that smelled of pine, tobacco, and a deep, aching loneliness. A rifle hung over the fireplace, and on the mantel a single photograph of a woman with laughing eyes. "Put the boy by the hearth," McCrae said, not looking at her. Clara gently unwrapped Eli, laying him on a worn quilt. He was so small, so fragile. "He doesn't talk," she said quietly. "Not since the fire." McCrae just nodded, like he already knew. He poured a glass of water and set it near her. "You sleep on the floor. You eat what I eat. You work when I say." "I don't expect comfort," she said. "Just safety." McCrae made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Ain't much of either in this world, girl." He stoked the fire and then walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the house. Clara sat with Eli, wrapping her arms around his small, shivering body. Outside, the wind howled, whispering secrets through the cracks in the walls. But as she stared into the flames, a strange feeling washed over her. She had made a deal with the devil in a lonely house. But for the first time in a week, she felt like she could finally breathe. She thought she was safe. She was wrong. The next morning, Clara was up before the sun. She found a milking pail and went to the barn. The work was hard, but it was honest. It was something she understood. As she worked, she felt McCrae's presence before she saw him. His shadow fell over her, long and dark. He watched her for a long time, not saying a word. When she was done, she stood up, wiping her hands on her dress. "I'll clean the chicken coop next," she said, not meeting his eyes. "You always this talkative?" he asked, his voice laced with something she couldn't quite place. She finally looked at him. "Words are for people who get heard." He turned and walked away without another word. The days fell into a strange rhythm. Work, eat, sleep. McCrae barely spoke to her. Eli remained silent, a little ghost haunting the corners of the house. The town, however, was buzzing. The whispers followed Clara like flies whenever she had to go for supplies. "That's the girl, the one McCrae took in. Heard she shares his bed. Poor thing. Wonder what he's doing to her." Clara ignored them. Their words were just noise, sticks and stones. But one night, something shifted. Clara was reading to Eli from a charred Bible she'd pulled from the ashes of their home. Her voice was low and soft in the quiet house. She didn't know that McCrae was watching from the shadows of the hallway. He listened as she read, his face unreadable. When she finished, she kissed Eli's forehead and tucked him in. McCrae slipped away before she could see him. Later that night, long after Clara and Eli were asleep, McCrae sat in his own room, staring at the photograph of the laughing woman. His wife. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small leather-bound journal. He opened it to a blank page, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up a pen. "She's here," he wrote. "The girl. She has fire in her eyes, the same fire you had." He paused, his pen hovering over the page. "Maybe," he wrote, his handwriting growing shaky, "maybe she's the one. Maybe she can finally help me find out what really happened to you." He closed the book and stared into the darkness. The whole town thought his wife had run off. They thought he had driven her away with his dark moods and his temper. But Will McCrae knew the truth. His wife hadn't left him. She had been taken. And he had a chilling suspicion that the same person who took her was the one who set the fire that destroyed Clara's life. The ranch wasn't just a refuge for Clara and Eli. It was a trap, and the bait was already set. Life on the ranch was a tightrope walk over a canyon of silence. Clara learned the language of McCrae's moods through the set of his jaw, the way he held his coffee cup. He was a man made of locked doors, and she didn't dare ask for the keys, but she started to notice things, small things that didn't add up. Late at night, she'd hear him pacing in his room, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Sometimes she'd see a flicker of light under his door, long after the rest of the house was dark. And then there was the locked room. It was at the end of the upstairs hallway. The door was thick, made of dark, heavy wood, and the keyhole was plugged with wax. He'd told her it was just for storage, but the one time Eli had wandered too close to it, McCrae had stormed out of his room, his face a mask of thunder. He hadn't yelled. He just picked Eli up, his hands surprisingly gentle, and carried him back downstairs. "Some places are filled with ghosts, son," he'd said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Best to let them be." What ghosts was he hiding? One afternoon, while McCrae was out mending a fence on the far side of the property, Clara found herself standing in front of that door. Her curiosity was a physical itch. She ran her fingers over the cool metal of the doorknob. It was locked, just as she knew it would be. But as she turned to leave, her foot caught on a loose floorboard. She knelt down, pressing on it. It gave way with a soft groan. Heart pounding, she pried it up. Underneath, wrapped in an oilcloth, was a small, tarnished silver key. Her hands were trembling. This was wrong. She knew it was wrong. This was his house, his secrets. But the whispers from town, the look in his eyes, the heavy silence of the ranch, it all pushed her forward. She put the key in the lock. It turned with a well-oiled click. The door swung open into a room preserved in time. It was a woman's bedroom. A thick layer of dust covered everything. But it was neat, orderly. A rocking chair sat by the window. A half-finished piece of embroidery lay in a basket next to it. On the nightstand, a book of poetry lay open, a dried flower marking the page. It was the room of the woman from the photograph, his wife. It wasn't the room of a woman who had packed her bags and left. It was the room of a woman who expected to come back. Clara walked over to the wardrobe and opened it. Dresses hung inside, smelling faintly of lavender and mothballs. She ran her hand along a blue cotton dress, the fabric soft under her fingers. And that's when she felt it. A small, hard object sewn into the hem. Her fingers fumbled with the thick thread until it came loose. She pulled out a tiny folded piece of paper. She carefully unfolded it. It wasn't a letter. It was a drawing. A crudely drawn picture of a bird. A raven, maybe, with a single unnaturally white feather in its wing. Underneath it was a date. A date from almost a year ago, just a week before McCrae's wife had supposedly vanished. What did it mean? Suddenly, a floorboard creaked downstairs. McCrae was back. Panic seized her. She shoved the paper into her pocket, her mind racing. She couldn't put the key back in time. She just had to close the door and hope he wouldn't notice. She pulled the door shut, the latch clicking loudly in the silent house. She sprinted down the hallway, her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest. She made it to the kitchen just as he walked in, his face slick with sweat from his work. He looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're flushed," he said. "It's warm in here," she lied, turning her back to him, pretending to be busy with the stove. He grunted and walked past her, heading upstairs. Clara held her breath, listening. She heard his heavy boots stop right outside the locked room. The silence stretched for an eternity. Every second was an agony. Then she heard his footsteps continue down the hall to his own room. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, her legs feeling like water. She had gotten away with it. But that night, as she lay on her pallet, the image of the raven with the white feather burned in her mind. It was a clue, a secret, and she was standing on the edge of a truth far more dangerous than she could ever imagine. The next day, McCrae sent her into Cinderfield for supplies. The town felt different now. The whispers seemed sharper, the stares more pointed. Clara clutched the list in her hand, the secret drawing in her pocket feeling like a hot coal against her skin. At the general store, Miss Wren, a woman whose face was a permanent sneer, measured out flour with slow, deliberate movements. "Heard he's been working you hard," she said, not looking at Clara. "I earned my keep," Clara replied, her voice flat. Miss Wren finally looked up, her eyes like chips of ice. "My niece used to work for the McCraes before, well, before." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She said Mrs. McCrae was a strange one, always drawing things. Birds mostly." Clara's blood ran cold. "Birds?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yep. Said she was obsessed with them, especially ravens." Miss Wren let out a short, harsh laugh. "Said they were messengers, omens." She paused, her eyes glinting. Guess she was right about that. Clara paid for the supplies and left, her mind reeling. Mrs. McCrae drew birds, ravens. As she was loading the supplies onto the buckboard, she saw Sheriff Keller talking to a few men outside the saloon. He was laughing, a big booming sound that didn't reach his eyes. As he turned, the sunlight caught something pinned to his lapel, a small silver pin, shaped like a single feather. Clara froze. It couldn't be. It had to be a coincidence. But as she watched, the sheriff reached up and tapped the pin, a strange, knowing smirk on his face. It was all connected. The drawing, the talk of ravens, the feather pin. This wasn't just a town with a bad attitude. This was a town with a secret they were all in on. And then her eyes fell on Eli. He was sitting on the buckboard, his back to the sheriff, but he was trembling. His little hands were clenched into fists, his knuckles white. "Eli?" she said softly. "What's wrong?" He didn't turn around. He just pointed a small, shaking finger. Not at the sheriff, but at the man standing next to him. A wiry, sharp-faced ranch hand she recognized. It was Silas Creel, a man who sometimes did odd jobs for McCrae. Eli's whole body was rigid with a terror so profound it made Clara's stomach clench. He hadn't reacted this way to anyone in town, only Silas. Why was Eli so afraid of him? And then the horrible truth hit her like a physical blow. The fire. Eli hadn't just been traumatized by the fire. He had seen something. He had seen someone. And that someone was standing 30 feet away, laughing with the sheriff who wore a silver feather on his chest. The ride back to the ranch was a blur. Clara's mind was a hornet's nest of fear and suspicion. Eli was a silent, shivering bundle beside her. He hadn't just seen Silas Creel at the fire. He was terrified of him. This changed everything. The fire wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. It was arson and murder. Silas Creel. Why? What could her family have possibly done to him? Her father was a preacher, a quiet man who kept to himself. Her mother was kindness itself. It made no sense. Unless her father knew something. Something about Mrs. McCrae's disappearance. Something that connected Silas, the sheriff, and the mysterious drawing of the raven. When they got back to the ranch, McCrae was in the barn, sharpening an axe. The rhythmic scrape of stone against steel filled the air. "Something wrong?" he asked, not looking up from his work. He could read her like a book. Clara hesitated. Could she trust him? He was hiding his own secrets. That locked room was proof of that, but he had taken them in. He had given them a roof, and right now he was the only person who might be able to protect them. "It's Silas," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Eli. He's afraid of him." McCrae stopped his work. He slowly looked up, his eyes boring into hers. Afraid? Or does he recognize him? The question hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. "I think," Clara said, her heart pounding, "I think he was there. The night of the fire." McCrae's face turned to stone. He set the axe down with a deliberate final thud. "Tell me everything." So she did. She told him about Miss Wren, about the talk of ravens. She told him about the sheriff's silver feather pin. And then, her hands shaking, she pulled the small, crumpled drawing from her pocket and handed it to him. He took the paper and stared at it. All the color drained from his face. He traced the outline of the raven with a trembling finger. "Mary," he whispered, the name a ghost on his lips. This was her mark. He looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a pain so deep it stole her breath. This bird, it was a code, a warning. She was part of a group, a secret society of sorts. The Order of the White Raven. They worked to expose corruption. They used this symbol to communicate. He crumpled the paper in his fist. She was investigating something here in Cinderfield. Something big. She told me she was getting close, but she wouldn't tell me what it was. She said it was too dangerous. His voice dropped, thick with grief and rage. The day she disappeared, she was supposed to meet with someone. Someone she trusted. Your father. Clara stumbled back as if he'd struck her. My father? Yes, he was helping her. He was gathering evidence. They were going to expose the whole rotten scheme. McCrae's gaze was distant, lost in a painful memory. I thought he'd abandoned her. I thought he'd gotten scared and run. That's why I never came looking for answers. My pride, my anger, it all clicked into place. The fire wasn't random. It was a message. A brutal, final message. They weren't just trying to scare her father. They were silencing him and destroying any evidence he might have collected. And Silas Creel was the man they sent to do it. The sheriff, Clara breathed. He's part of it. He's the head of it, McCrae snarled. Keller runs this county like his own personal kingdom. Smuggling, land grabs, you name it. Mary was going to burn it all to the ground. He looked from the crumpled paper to Clara, a new, terrifying light in his eyes. They didn't just take my wife. They murdered your family. The barn suddenly felt small, the air thick and hard to breathe. They weren't just two broken people hiding from the world. They were the last loose ends in a conspiracy that had already claimed the lives of the people they loved. And the conspirators knew they were here. Silas had seen Eli. He must know the boy was a witness. They weren't safe. They had never been safe. That night a storm rolled in, the sky turning a bruised purple. Thunder cracked overhead, and rain lashed against the windows. It was as if the world itself was raging against the injustice. McCrae didn't sleep. He sat in the main room, his rifle across his lap, his eyes fixed on the door. Clara sat with him, the silence between them no longer awkward, but filled with a shared purpose. "What was in the locked room?" he asked suddenly, his voice quiet. Clara flinched. I, I'm sorry. "Don't be," he said, his gaze not leaving the door. "I locked it because I couldn't stand to look at it. It was like she was still there, waiting, but I couldn't protect her." He finally looked at Clara. "I won't make that mistake again." The unspoken promise hung in the air. He would protect them. Just before dawn, the storm passed. A heavy fog settled over the land, muffling all sound. McCrae stood up, his body tense. "He'll come for the boy," he said. "Silas. He knows he can't leave a witness, and he'll want to finish the job." "What do we do?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "We don't wait for him to come to us," McCrae said, a grim set to his jaw. He went to a loose stone in the hearth and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger. He flipped it open. It was filled with Mary's neat, precise handwriting, columns of names, dates, and figures. "This is it," he whispered. "This is what your father died for. It's all here. Every crime, every bribe. It's the proof Mary gathered." He looked at Clara. "The sheriff thinks this was destroyed in the fire. He doesn't know I have a copy." A plan began to form in his eyes, hard and sharp as flint. "He'll come for the boy," McCrae repeated, "but he won't be expecting us to be waiting for him." He handed Clara a small pistol from a locked chest. The metal was cold and heavy in her hand. "You know how to use this?" he asked. Clara thought of the fire, of her parents' faces, of Eli's terrified silence. "I'll learn," she said. The fog was their ally. It clung to the ranch like a shroud, turning the familiar landscape into a ghostly maze. McCrae's plan was desperate, bordering on suicidal. They would use Eli as bait. It was a horrible thought, but it was the only way. Silas had to believe he was walking into an easy trap. They set it up in the barn. McCrae had Clara take Eli and hide in the hayloft behind a wall of bales, with the pistol clutched in her hands. "Don't shoot unless you have to," he'd instructed, his voice low and urgent. "My signal will be a whistle, the sound of a meadowlark. When you hear it, it's over, one way or another." McCrae positioned himself in an empty stall, hidden in the deep shadows, his own rifle ready. The ledger, the proof that could bring down the whole corrupt town, was tucked inside his shirt. Then they waited. The silence was a living thing. Every creak of the old barn, every rustle of a mouse in the hay, sounded like an approaching army. Clara held Eli close, his small body still trembling. She whispered in his ear, telling him it was a game of hide and seek. But he knew. His eyes were wide with a terror that mirrored her own. Hours passed. The fog began to thin as the sun rose higher, but the world outside remained eerily quiet. Had they been wrong? Was Silas not coming? And then a floorboard creaked near the barn's side entrance. It was a soft sound, almost imperceptible, but in the charged silence it was as loud as a scream. Clara's heart leaped into her throat. She tightened her grip on the pistol, her knuckles white. She peered through a tiny gap between the hay bales. A figure slipped into the barn, moving like a shadow. It was Silas Creel. He held a long, wicked-looking knife in his hand, its blade glinting dully in the dim light. His eyes scanned the barn, feral and alert. He was hunting. He took a few steps forward, then paused, listening. "Little boy," he called out, his voice a sick, sweet poison. "I know you're in here. I just want to talk." He took another step, his boots crunching softly on the hay-strewn floor. He was directly below the loft now. Clara could smell the sour scent of whiskey and sweat. She held her breath, praying Eli would stay silent. Silas chuckled, a low guttural sound. "The sheriff sends his regards. He hates loose ends." He was toying with them. He knew they were there. He was enjoying the fear. Clara could feel McCrae's tension from across the barn. He was waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect shot. But Silas was clever, staying close to the stalls, never giving him a clear line of sight. "Come on out," Silas cooed. "We can make this quick, just like your pa." Rage, hot and blinding, surged through Clara. This man, this monster, was bragging about murdering her father. Her finger tightened on the trigger. Not yet, she told herself. Wait for the signal. Silas began to move toward the ladder to the hayloft. He knew. He knew they were up there. Clara's mind screamed. McCrae didn't have a shot. In seconds, Silas would be up the ladder. He would see them. It would all be over. She had to do something. Just as Silas placed his hand on the first rung of the ladder, Clara made a decision. She couldn't wait for the signal. She took a deep breath, aimed the pistol at the floorboards just in front of the ladder, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the confined space. Wood splintered and Silas yelped in surprise, jumping back from the ladder. The shot had missed him, but it had done its job. It had startled him, forced him out into the open, and in that split second, McCrae moved. He stepped out from the shadows, his rifle already at his shoulder. "Looking for someone, Creel," he snarled. Silas spun around, his face a mask of shock and rage. He raised his knife, but he was too slow. But before McCrae could pull the trigger, another voice echoed through the barn. "Drop it, McCrae!" Sheriff Keller stood in the main doorway, a shotgun leveled at McCrae's chest. He wasn't alone. Two of his deputies flanked him, their own guns drawn. They had been played. This wasn't just Silas coming to clean up a loose end. This was an ambush. The sheriff smiled, a cold, predatory grin. "You really think it would be that easy? I've been 10 steps ahead of you since that girl first showed her face in my town." His eyes flickered up toward the hayloft. "Now throw down the rifle. And you, girl, come on down. Bring the boy. Let's end this little family reunion." McCrae was trapped. Silas was grinning, inching closer to him. The sheriff and his men had the only exit covered. It was over. They had lost. Clara looked at Eli. His face was pale, streaked with tears. She looked at the pistol in her hand. One bullet gone. Maybe 5 left. Not enough. But then she remembered the signal. The meadowlark's whistle. McCrae hadn't made the sound. Why? Was he waiting for something? Or was there another part of the plan he hadn't told her about? "I said, drop it!" Keller barked, cocking the shotgun. The sound was a death sentence. McCrae slowly, deliberately, lowered his rifle and let it fall to the floor. He raised his hands in surrender. "Good man," the sheriff said, stepping into the barn. "Now where's that ledger Mary was so fond of? The one your preacher friend was holding for her?" Silas here couldn't seem to find it in the ashes. McCrae just stared at him, his face a granite mask. "No matter," Keller said with a shrug. "We'll find it on your corpse." He nodded to Silas. "Finish it." Silas advanced on McCrae, his knife held high, a triumphant leer on his face. And that's when it happened. A high, clear whistle cut through the tension. 3 notes, the call of a meadowlark. But it didn't come from McCrae. It came from outside the barn. For a split second, everyone froze. Sheriff Keller's head whipped toward the sound, his face clouded with confusion. And in that moment of distraction, the world exploded. A shot rang out, not from inside the barn, but from the woods beyond. One of the deputies at the door cried out and crumpled to the ground. Before anyone could react, another shot. The second deputy went down. Sheriff Keller stared in disbelief, his shotgun wavering. Who was out there? McCrae didn't waste the opportunity. He lunged, not at Silas, but at the floor. He rolled, coming up with the axe he'd been sharpening earlier. With a roar of pure rage, he threw it. The axe spun end over end through the air, a silver blur. Silas didn't even have time to scream. It hit him square in the chest, the force of the blow throwing him backward into a stall. Keller, snapping out of his shock, swung the shotgun toward McCrae. But he was too late. From the hayloft, Clara saw her chance. The sheriff was focused on McCrae, his back partially turned to her. She took aim with the small pistol, her hand surprisingly steady. She remembered what her father had taught her on a hunt years ago. Breathe out, squeeze, don't pull. She fired. The bullet hit Keller in the shoulder. He roared in pain, staggering, the shotgun blast going wild and tearing a hole in the barn roof. It was chaos. Gunshots from an unseen ally. McCrae charging like a bull. The sheriff wounded and furious. Keller scrambled backward, clutching his shoulder, his eyes wild with panic and hate. He fired the second barrel of the shotgun wildly toward the hayloft, forcing Clara and Eli to duck as pellets shredded the hay bales around them. He used the moment to run. He stumbled out of the barn and disappeared into the fog. McCrae ran to the doorway, rifle in hand. But the sheriff was gone. The fog had swallowed him whole. Silence descended on the barn, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded deputy and the sound of McCrae's ragged breathing. Silas was dead. The other deputy looked to be gone, too. "Clara! Eli!" McCrae yelled, his voice raw. "We're okay," she called back, her own voice shaking. She and Eli scrambled down the ladder. McCrae rushed to them, pulling them both into a fierce, protective embrace. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said, her face buried in his chest. "We're okay." But as the adrenaline began to fade, 100 questions rushed in. Who was out there? Who was the hidden shooter? Who gave the signal? As if in answer, a figure emerged from the fog at the edge of the woods. A tall, broad-shouldered man holding a hunting rifle. He walked toward the barn with a steady, determined gait. As he got closer, his features became clear. He was an older man with a weathered face and kind eyes. A man Clara had never seen before. But McCrae knew him. His face registered shock, then disbelief, then a dawning, impossible hope. "John," McCrae breathed. "John Bell?" Clara looked from the stranger to McCrae, her mind struggling to make sense of the name. Bell. That was her name. The man stopped a few feet away, his eyes finding Clara's. A sad, gentle smile touched his lips. "Hello, Clarabelle," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't place. It wasn't her father. Her father was dead. She had seen the body. This man. Who was this man? "I'm your father's brother," the man said, as if reading her mind. "Your uncle." Clara stared, speechless. She had an uncle? Her father had never spoken of a brother. "Your father sent for me weeks ago," John Bell continued, his eyes full of a deep sorrow. "He knew Keller and his men were closing in. He told me what he and Mary McCrae had uncovered. He gave me a copy of all his notes, just in case." He looked at McCrae. "Will, I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner. The message took time to reach me. By the time I got here," he trailed off, the words unnecessary. It was all too much. A secret uncle, a hidden plot, a bloody gunfight in a barn. Clara's legs gave out, and she sank to the ground. But the stranger, her uncle, wasn't finished. He had one more revelation, one more piece of the puzzle that would change everything she thought she knew. He looked down at little Eli, who was peering out from behind Clara's legs. "The fire," her uncle said, his voice heavy. "It was meant to destroy the evidence your father had, but it was also meant to hide another crime." He took a deep breath. "Sheriff Keller didn't just murder your parents, Clara. He was there to retrieve something, something your father had taken from him." He knelt down, his eyes locking with Eli's. "The night Mary McCrae disappeared," he said slowly, deliberately, "she wasn't alone. She had her son with her, a little boy, no older than Eli." McCrae went rigid. "My son died of a fever years ago. That's what Keller wanted everyone to believe," John Bell said, his gaze never leaving the small boy. "But it was a lie. He faked the boy's death. He kidnapped him. He was using him as leverage against Mary to keep her quiet." He looked at McCrae, his eyes filled with a terrible pity. "Your father, Clara, he was a hero. He managed to rescue the boy from where Keller was holding him. He took him in, passing him off as his own son to keep him safe until he and Mary could expose everything." A deafening silence filled the air. Clara stared at the small, silent boy clinging to her skirt. The boy she had carried for miles. The boy she had protected. The boy she had called Eli. "Your son didn't die, Will," her uncle said, his voice breaking. "He's been here all along." The world tilted on its axis. McCrae stared at the boy, his face a canvas of agony and disbelief. This whole time his son, his own flesh and blood, had been living under his roof, and he hadn't even known. He took a shaky step forward, then another. He knelt in the dirt, his eyes searching the boy's face, looking for a ghost of his wife, a shadow of himself. The boy looked back at him, his own eyes wide and uncertain. Then for the first time in months, the boy spoke. It was just one word, a tiny, fragile sound. "Pa?" It broke the dam. A raw, ragged sob tore from McCrae's throat. He reached out and pulled the boy into his arms, holding him not as a stranger, but as a long-lost piece of his own soul. He buried his face in the boy's hair, his shoulders shaking with the force of his grief and his joy. Clara watched, tears streaming down her own face. Her brother. The boy she thought was her brother. He wasn't hers at all. He belonged to this broken man. A part of her felt a sharp, sudden loss, but it was overwhelmed by a wave of profound relief. He was safe. He was home. But Sheriff Keller was still out there, wounded but alive. And he knew they had the ledger. He would be back, and he wouldn't come alone. "We have to go," her uncle said, his voice pulling them back to the grim reality. "We take the evidence and ride for the state capitol. It's the only way." They didn't have much time. They gathered what they could: the ledger, guns, ammunition, and a little food. The wounded deputy was tied up securely in the barn. As they were about to leave, McCrae paused. He turned to Clara, his eyes still red, but clear now, filled with a gratitude so immense it was humbling. "Everything I have is yours," he said, his voice thick. "This ranch, this land. When this is over, it's all yours." Clara shook her head. "I don't want your ranch, Mr. McCrae." "Then what do you want?" She looked at the boy, his small hand now tucked firmly in McCrae's. She looked at the uncle she never knew she had. She looked at the horizon where a new day was breaking. "A choice," she said. "For the first time in my life, I just want a choice." The ride was grueling. They pushed their horses hard, avoiding the main roads, cutting across open country. Every shadow looked like one of Keller's men. Every distant sound was a potential threat. Her Uncle John proved to be a capable and calming presence. He was a tracker, he explained. He'd lived his life in the mountains, away from the corruption of towns like Cinderfield. He told Clara stories about her father, about a childhood she'd never known. He was filling in the empty spaces of her life, one memory at a time. McCrae was a changed man. He rode with his son in front of him, one protective arm always around him. He spoke to the boy in low, gentle tones, relearning the language of fatherhood. And the boy, whose real name was Daniel, started to talk more, his voice growing stronger with every mile they put between them and the ranch. They rode for 2 days straight, stopping only to rest the horses. On the third day, as they crested a ridge, they saw it. The capital city, a sprawling collection of buildings that represented law, order, and justice. They had made it. They went straight to the U.S. Marshal's office. The marshal was a stern, no-nonsense man with a thick mustache and skeptical eyes. He listened to their story, his expression unchanging, his gaze moving from the blood-stained ledger to McCrae's haunted face to Clara's determined one. When they were finished, he was silent for a long time. "Sheriff Keller is a respected man," he said finally. "These are serious allegations." "The proof is in that book," McCrae said, his voice firm. The marshal opened the ledger. He read page after page, his eyebrows climbing higher on his forehead. He saw the names, the dates, the meticulously recorded crimes. He saw the raven symbols Mary had drawn in the margins. He closed the book and looked at them. "I'll be sending a dozen of my best men to Cinderfield," he said. "If even half of what's in this book is true, Keller and his whole rotten town are finished." Justice, it turned out, moved with surprising speed. A week later, word came back. Sheriff Keller and a handful of his cronies had tried to make a stand. They were either dead or in federal custody. The town of Cinderfield was being cleaned out from top to bottom. The order of the White Raven's work was finally done. In the aftermath, they found themselves in a strange new world, a world without fear. John Bell decided to stay for a while, to get to know the niece he had just met. He and Clara spent hours talking, forging a bond that felt both new and ancient. McCrae was focused on his son. He bought him new clothes, a real bed, toys. He was making up for lost time, healing the wounds of the past with the simple balm of a father's love. One evening, Clara found McCrae sitting on the porch of the boarding house where they were staying. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "Daniel's asleep," he said, not looking at her. "He's a good boy," Clara said softly. "He's alive because of you," McCrae said, his voice choked with emotion. "You and your father. I owe you a debt I can never repay." "You don't owe me anything," she said. "We saved each other." They sat in a comfortable silence, watching the last of the sun disappear. "So," he said finally, "you have your choice now. What will you do?" Clara thought about the future. For the first time, it wasn't a terrifying black void, but an open road. She could stay with her uncle. She could find a job in the city. She could go anywhere, be anyone. She thought of the ranch, the smell of the barn, the creak of the floorboards, the warmth of the hearth. It was a place of ghosts and pain, but it was also the place where she had found her strength, the place where she had fought back. "I think," she said slowly, a small smile playing on her lips, "that I know a certain ranch that could use a good hand. The fences are probably sagging already." McCrae looked at her, and for the first time she saw the man he must have been before grief hollowed him out. His eyes were clear, and he was smiling. A real, genuine smile. "I reckon you're right," he said. "They weren't a conventional family. They were a collection of broken pieces forged together in fire and loss. A man who got his son back, a girl who found a home, a boy who found his voice, and an uncle who found the family he thought he'd lost forever. They returned not to Cinderfield, but to the McCrae Ranch. They rebuilt the barn stronger this time. They planted a garden. They filled the lonely house with something it hadn't had in a very long time. Laughter. The scars were still there, of course. They would always be there. But scars are just a reminder that you were stronger than whatever tried to hurt you. And Clarabelle, the girl who had arrived with nothing but a silent boy and a desperate offer, had found something more valuable than safety. She had found a place to belong. This story is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, when it feels like all hope is lost, courage and the will to fight for what's right can change everything. It's about uncovering the truth, no matter how terrifying, and seeking justice, no matter the cost. If you were in Clara's shoes, what would you have done? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of incredible survival and unexpected twists, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next.